Good evening, everybody. We get the meeting kicked off. This is the March chapter meeting for the ChicagoLand INCOSE. We've got a nice agenda today. I'm really excited to introduce again Lou Wheatcraft, who is our feature presentation tonight. Lou was in with us last month, and really just to introduce some of the new deliverables from the requirements working group, and now is back to really dig into the topic of understanding stakeholders' needs before defining requirements. And as you can see, Lou has a lot of experience and has probably spent more time thinking and writing about requirements management than most anybody in the world. Experience in aerospace, from the Air Force all the way through to modern pieces today. As you can see, he's consulting with clients in government and industries in aerospace, defense, medical devices, consumer goods, transportation, energy, really everywhere. With that, I can say one more time from the board, thanks, Lou, for coming again and presenting to the Chicagoland chapter. Really appreciate you coming and sharing your knowledge with us. Whenever you're ready, let's dig into it.
Thank you again for having me. We're going to dive into Lifecycle Concepts and Needs Definition Overview. That's section 4 of the Needs and Requirements Manual. And also to the Guide to Needs and Requirements, section 2. We plan to release that in April. Last month, I gave a general overview of the Needs and Requirements Manual. You probably noticed that we're changing the name. It was called Needs Requirements Verification Validation Lifecycle Manual. A lot of people are saying that title is too long. So we shortened up the title and then added a subtitle to still get the thought across. And then Tammy Katz is working on the Guide to Needs and Requirements, which is focused on the portion of the manual, but a big part of it is the topic of lifecycle concepts and needs definition. Focus, like I says, what we're doing up front, doing lifecycle concept definition analysis, maturation, defining an integrated set of needs. And then from these, then will be transformed into a set of requirements I would call design input requirements. I take a lot of the terminology from the medical device world and in the FDA's Title 21, Part 820. I think it really clarifies certain things that we have problems with in the engineering world overall. And so the manual is very heavily influenced by a lot of what was in the FDA part of it. And so we're covering section 4 and 5 of the manual and section 2 of the Guide to Needs and Requirements. It supplements and elaborates on the INCOSE System Engineering Handbook, Stakeholder Needs Requirements Definition, and System Requirements Definition Process. And INCOSE is in the process of updating the System Engineering Handbook to version 5. And Mike Rye and I are co-authors of the Stakeholder Needs and Requirements Definition Process and the System Requirements Definition Process. And we also are reviewing 15288, which is undergoing revision also. And so this last week, I've been going from the 15288 to the System Engineering Handbook for version 5 and making sure all three are aligned. The System Engineering Handbook is very page limited. Each process is like 3 or 4 pages, maybe, of the technical processes. And half of those are pretty much kind of a repeat of the activities from 15288. So there's just so much that you can fit in as far as giving people practical guidance on really how to do some of the things that are mentioned within the handbook. And so one of the reasons we developed the manual to give people that more in-depth guidance, elaboration on what's in the handbook. And there's some ambiguity and inconsistencies in ontology, the terminology that's used. And so the manual addresses some of that. This particular presentation will focus on this front-end work, the lifecycle concepts needs definition. And it's important because that's what you're going to validate your system of interest against. In the end, final acceptance is based on you passing system validation. So it's important that we understand what is necessary for acceptance at the very beginning. Project success is based on system validation, validating that the realized physical integrated system meets its intended purpose use as defined within the integrated set of needs. I really focus on the physical world, system validation, system verification concerning the physical world instead of the conceptual world, which is what we define as some verification simulation activities that help with design verification validation. Identify and assess the behavior and emerging properties in the actual operational environment when operated by the actual intended users. Does not enable unintended users to negatively impact the intended use of a system, nor allow unintended users to use the system in an unintended way. And we've added this, and this is to appear in the new System Engineering Handbook. In today's cyber world and so on, cybersecurity, that's something that we have to think about. If it's connected to the web in any way, there's a chance that someone's going to do bad things with it. So validation has to address all these things. And it's assumed the organization has moved to a data-centric practice of system engineering, What's advocated in the manual and what we're doing in the requirement working group is that the real intent of moving to MBSE is moving from a document-centric practice of systems engineering to a data-centric practice of system engineering. And with that, you have an integrated data and information model, which includes needs and requirements. It includes all your design artifacts. It includes your model simulation artifacts. They're all part of that data and information model. To read more about that, you can download the requirement working group paper, Integrated Data as the Foundation of System Engineering. We talk about needs and requirements. Needs represent the stakeholder, customer, acquirer view of the system of interest. If you look in 15288 for the system requirements definition process and the definition of it, it says the whole purpose is to move from the stakeholder view of the system to a technical developer view of the system. And so it's very important that we understand both views. And if we don't understand the stakeholder view up front, customer acquirer view up front of the system, then what are we going to validate against? And so what's going to take to make the customer happy? We have to uncover this information first before we're able to develop our needs. While the needs communicate what the stakeholders need from a system, the requirements, we call the design input requirements, represent what the system must do in order for those needs to be realized. So we're going to validate against an integrated set of needs and verify it against the design input requirements. And I'll talk about why we talk about the integrated set of needs as part of the presentation. But the quality of the requirements that we have is dependent on the quality of the needs from which they're transformed. And the needs are dependent upon how much work and analysis that we do up front in order to come up with those needs. One of the strengths of system engineering is that you decompose the system into parts and they can be further decomposed into lower level subsystem system elements. But no matter where your system of interest is in this hierarchy, you'll see the CN and R in here. That's concept, needs, and requirements that needs to be done. So whatever we're talking about today applies to your system of interest, no matter where you are within this architecture. This decomposition process doesn't have to be equal for every level, but it stops when no further elaboration is needed for the project to make a build, buy, code, reuse decision. That's explained a lot more in the manual. And another view, there's different levels of requirements within an organization. At the top, you have the organization's strategic view that defines the company, what you're doing, what your brand is, and you have a set of business requirements. Those constrain everything that goes on. Then we have a business operations level. This is where your business units exist. This is where your programs and projects exist. And if there's going to be a new project that's going to be formulated, then it begins at this level. And at this level, there's going to be preliminary lifecycle concepts. There's going to be business operation level needs, business operation level requirements. The system engineering handbook, this is what's referred to as the stakeholder needs and stakeholder requirements. And then those flow down to the product or system that we're going to develop. They constrain what's going on. One mistake some organizations do is they fail to realize there are higher level concepts, needs, and requirements that are constraining what they're going to do. You also notice that no matter what level there's stakeholder real world expectations that we must understand. And then we have the MGOs and mission goals and objectives, our measures, use cases, operational scenarios, stakeholder needs and requirements, drivers, constraints, risk. We have to discover all this information that's used to feed into our lifecycle concepts. And then once we have a feasible set of lifecycle concepts, we can transform those into a set of system needs. And then those are in turn are transformed into a set of design input requirements at the system level. These all flow down to the next level of architecture, the subsystems, which then do the same kind of stuff, and then flow down the lower levels. System engineering is iterative recursive process by definition. The area for lifecycle concept needs definition. That's the focus of this presentation and will be the focus of the seminar. There's stakeholders at each level. They have their own real world expectations concerning a problem opportunity, and they have expected outcomes. If we don't understand that up front, we're doomed to failure. And so the lifecycle concept needs and requirements are defined for the entities to each level to address those expectations. Whatever you do at one level is going to constrain the next level. So project success depends on the project team understanding the source of the concern, problem, opportunity, higher level lifecycle concepts, higher level needs, higher level requirements that define what's going to be acceptable or desirability of a solution, what measures are going to be used to define how well you've done, and what are the conditions in which it must operate. This understanding is required no matter which level your system of interest exists. Some organizations mistakenly say, well, we're going to focus on do all this stuff at the top system level, but then they tend not to do as much this for lower level parts of the architecture. And as you move down the architecture, it's going to take less and less time because you're focusing in on a specific area, but the knowledge gained is really needed for success. By gathering this knowledge, then we can develop our lifecycle concepts. We can define those, analyze those, mature those, and then develop a formal integrated set of needs that are defined, agreed to, and then baselined by all the stakeholders. And so there's a lot of work to be done before developing our requirements. Primary reason for project failure is a failure to recognize the need for doing all this upfront work. So this is a real popular diagram that we developed. It shows the life for any system of interest, and this applies to any system of interest. It talks about validation, verification, integration. In the past, one of the problems with the system engineering V is everyone thought about integration, verification, validation, and something happened on the right side of the V. The V is losing its popularity because of some misconceptions that people have using the V. On the bottom are what we call the design controls, all the organizational requirements for doing all the different process activities. Together, they form a quality management system as defined in the medical device world. So we're going to focus on this upfront piece as we go through this presentation and in the seminar. And so the lifecycle concept needs definition. We have a lot of information that we're going to gather, and that all feeds into our lifecycle concept analysis maturation activities. Then we do a needs analysis, and that comes as an integrated set of needs. And then through requirements analysis, then we develop our requirements. Through all this, we'll start modeling at the beginning, and we need to develop our functional models, our context diagrams, all the interactions, develop a functional architecture, and turn that into a physical architecture, into the realized system. And then we have verification and validation activities that we define as we're doing this. In the manual, each of the different chapters has an IPO diagram. It's different than the one that's in the System Engineering Handbook. It's specific to the terminology used within the manual and the guide. We have several enablers that organizations need to make sure are in place to be successful. We have a lot of inputs that our job is to actually pull the information out of each of these. And that's part of the activities that we're doing here, is to get that information, and then that results in the information, the outputs in the right. So there's a step for each one of these things. We start with preparing lifecycle concept needs definition. So that's making sure we have all those enablers in place, make sure that we have access to the information, the inputs to the processes. And then we go through each of these steps. And the section numbers here are section numbers within the manual. And I have a slide in each one of these boxes as we go through. And then this is a continuation. Once we have our preliminary information, we put that into a preliminary integrated set of lifecycle concepts. Historically, that's been in some document like a OpsCon document or something like that. And then we need to mature the lifecycle concepts, do analysis, maturation. Out of that comes needs, our people needs, our process needs, and our needs for our system itself. The people needs are needs of the project team. If we're going to outsource something to a supplier, then there's going to be needs according to the supplier that needs to be followed to put into our contracts, statement of work, supplier agreements. There's going to be needs for processes, which we're going to build our work instructions, procedures, and so on. But those things aren't covered in this manual. That's a future goal, is to produce another product on the requirement working group that addresses these. But for right now, we're focusing on a system. However, when we're doing the lifecycle concepts, we have to have a systems thinking view. And so we have to take a very broad picture, people, process, and tools, or products as we're going through this. System engineering and project management are two sides of the same coin. One thing advocated in the manual is to knock down the silos and have this integrated collaborative team of both project management and system engineering to do all this. So as you're going through Lifecycle Concepts, you're doing concepts. How am I going to actually do project management? How am I going to do system engineering? I have to develop an architecture because the architecture can be mapped to a work breakdown structure, which helps me with my budget and schedule, helps me with coming up with an acquisition plan. When I take pieces of that out, I'm going to outsource those. And so they all have to be together. There's going to be needs and requirements, concepts for all of those things. That also allows us to develop an architecture for our data and information that we're going to manage within our SE toolset. The red lines on here, for years when I taught classes for requirements, we went from Lifecycle Concepts, and then by magic, we ended up with requirements. And we ignored the fact that needs come in between and all the analysis that needs to take place to establish feasibility. And so that's a way that it's been done in the past, but it doesn't really work well for today's increasingly complex software intensive systems. Going through each of these activity steps, first thing we need to do is define that problem, threat, opportunity. This is the whole reason for the project existing. This is why we're developing certain products. So we need to understand that. We need to identify the organization's strategic and business operations level stakeholders that are impacted by the problem or threat. If you're developing consumer products, you're going to be wanting to know what the problems and opportunities exist in the consumer market that your organization can take advantage of and help define your product line. You have to work with the stakeholders to understand how they're impacted by the problem or threat, or how they're going to benefit by pursuing an opportunity. And then clearly define a statement of the problem, threat, or opportunity. And this can be kind of difficult. It's surprising when I go in and work with some organizations, one of the first things to do is I ask them, what is the reason for the project? What's the problem, threat, opportunity? And I asked 5 different people and I get 5 different answers. And so that is an issue. Once we do get that statement written down, then we want to get agreement with the stakeholders so that the project team and the stakeholders are all in sync. And so this is important, starts all projects out. What is that problem, threat, opportunity that we're addressing? And then from that, we have mission goals and objectives and measures. A mission statement defines why project exists, what needs to be accomplished. In one sentence, what's the expected outcome that we're going to have? Goals are elaborated from the mission statement, communicating those things that need to be achieved. Objectives are elaborated from the goals. More details concern must be done to meet the goals that and result in the achievement of what we're supposed to be trying to do. Measures that are used to validate the objectives against, so we can manage the system across the life cycle. Now, when we talk about needs, there's a hierarchy of needs. And so the mission statement, goals, objectives, and measures are top of the pyramid when it comes to needs. The achievement of these should result in achievement of the integrated set of needs, the more detailed needs for the system of interest. And from a management standpoint, if you don't meet their goals and objectives, then you can't claim success. So it's important that we clearly define these up front, get an agreement between management and the project team. And a lot of times this is going to be done at that business operations level. And this is going to be part of the formulation paperwork to initiate a project, is that management is going to come up and say, here's our problem statement, here's the mission statement, goals and objectives, and here's a pot of money to go make it happen. And there's an expectation that you're going to meet this. But these are just very high level. And so the project team has to go then and dive in and do the analysis and figure out more details to be successful. The way they do that is identify internal and external stakeholders. They're the primary source of needs and requirements. And the choice of the relevant set of stakeholders is critical, being able to determine what's complete and correct of our integrated needs and the resulting design input requirements. If there any individual organization has a personal stake in the system of interest, they'll be affected by it or participate. I like to use the acronym VIP. Anyone has a vested interest, anyone that has influence, and anyone that's going to participate. A key part of stakeholder identification is to identify who the approving authorities are within the group of stakeholders. And when we talk about approving authorities, when we go through the system verification and validation There's a whole series of steps to do. In the end, there's going to be testing done as part of verification to make sure the system met its design input requirements. The result of that testing is going to be data and information, and that's going to be put into some type of an approval package, which then can be given to an approval authority, and they can say, yes, you have met the requirements. And the same for validation against the needs. You're going to run a different kind of set of tests for system validation. You're going to collect data that's evidence that the needs have been met. That's going to be put into an approval package and given to the approving authorities. In the case of a medical device, that's the package you're going to give to the FDA, and they're going to either approve or not approve your product for release for its intended use. And there can be many stakeholders over its life cycle. Therefore, we don't want to focus just on operations. We need to consider all the life cycles for the system. So how are we going to develop it? How are we going to test it? How are we going to market it? How are we going to actually get it? Are we going to build it in-house? Are we going to acquire it? How's it going to be transported? How's it going to be installed? How's it going to be used? How's it going to be maintained? How's it going to be disposed of? All of these life cycles have different stakeholders and different requirements. One problem I see a lot of organizations making is that they tend to maybe focus on user or customer. They'll have a user requirements document or a customer requirements document. But in reality, from a system level, I have multiple stakeholders that I have to involve, both internal and external, in addition to just the users, the customers. So instead of saying like VOC, voice of the customer, I think VOX. If you base your whole program on just users or customers' needs, you're probably going to be missing a good portion of the requirements that need to be actually defined and implemented by your product. Once we have the stakeholders, we're going to elicit their needs and the stakeholder own the requirements. And so we have to have a dialogue with our stakeholders to understand what their needs and technical requirements are. And like I said, not just during operations, but for all lifecycle stages. This allows the project team to discover and understand just what is needed, what current processes exist, how the stakeholders are going to interact with the system of interest, what happens over its life cycle, good and bad, what are the states in transition it might undergo, what's nominal, autonomical, off-nominal operations, and other considerations. The stakeholders are the ones that have this knowledge that we need to be successful. We need to understand their perspective, and each stakeholder has a slightly different perspective depending on their role and how they're going to interact with the system of interest across the life cycle. We leave out a key stakeholder, we're going to have missing requirements. We have to understand the source and context, the rationale of their stated needs and requirements. So one of your best words that you're going to have is why. If you can't ask that why question and give good answers so you understand exactly what they're saying, you're going to have problems. There's a whole lot of techniques and methods for doing this. And one thing that's really great now with the increased use of models and diagrams, we can start that during the elicitation activities. I attended another meeting, and the person that was giving the talk was talking about MBSE, but he's really talking about model-based design. His whole process of modeling started with a set of requirements. But in reality, we start the modeling way earlier as a way to discover our needs and requirements. And then those models can be expanded as we move through the life cycle. So modeling and diagramming tools are something that we're going to use up front. Successful elicitation results from the proper planning and on the methods and identification of the types of information to be obtained and specific questions asked that will result in information. Each of these sections that I have in here, there's probably 5, 6 or more pages in the manual that go into a lot of detail, and you need to read those to get that information. Once we have done the elicitation, we've got to document the outcomes. It's got to be recorded into your integrated data set. Again, we're assuming you're practicing a data-centric view. And so the form will depend on the product development approaches and the tools that you're using to record the information. However you do it, you want to make sure that that data is in a form that you can easily access, and it'll support traceability across the life cycle. You also have to understand that when you're dealing with stakeholders, they're imperfect. And so what comes out of the stakeholders, you may need to do some more work. The stakeholders may have some uncertainty as to the expected results. The old saying, I won't know what I want till you show me what it is. There's going to be some ambiguity as to what was being communicated. There's going to be incomplete, inconsistent, and conflicting information. If you got 10 different stakeholders, you're bound to have inconsistencies and conflicting views. A lot of stakeholders like to give you the how instead of the what. They want to jump right into a design solution instead of going back as to the design inputs. They're going to explicitly state needs and requirements, but there's some implicit that aren't stated. And we need to understand what is not being said as much as what is being said. Because sometimes the expectations like it's going to actually work and it's going to be reliable. There's a lot of quality attributes that the stakeholders may not even communicate. They just expect that you're going to give them a quality product. And so we need to pull out those implicit needs and requirements as well. And then there's always the question of feasibility as to what the needs and requirements say. When you look at the INCOSE guide to writing requirements for both individual requirements and needs and requirements and sets of needs and requirements, one of the key characteristics is feasibility. Feasibility, though, exists in the physical world. And so that means during the lifecycle concept analysis maturation, we're going to have to dive into the physical world. We're going to have to define architecture, and we're going to have to define some design approaches, alternatives to see what is feasible, identify critical technologies, assess the maturity of those technologies. So the project team has to be prepared to address all these challenges and issues during elicitation, as well as when they start documenting the information. Another really important thing that we need to focus on are what are the driver's constraints. These are those things that are imposed on you from the outside that you have to show compliance with. We have the design constraints, we have design standards, we have production constraints, we have all the human factors things, we have regulation law we have to do, the operating environment, both natural and induced, and then we can't forget the social cultural environment as well, all the interactions, interfaces, dependencies with existing systems. I mentioned the technology maturity. We always have cost and schedule, and there's emission drivers, like for a space system, there's different things. And then like I showed in the previous chart, there's higher level concepts, needs, requirements that have been allocated to your system. And so these have to be dealt with as well. And so driver constraints can be a major source of requirements. Hopefully a lot of those came out of the elicitation if you use the right stakeholders. But the reason why we treat those as two separate topics is so you can play them against each other. By thinking driver's constraints, you may find out we have these, did we involve those particular stakeholders that are responsible for this? If you have an interaction with another system, did you talk to the stakeholder that owns that other system about the interactions? You identify, here's the law that we have to follow. Well, who's the stakeholder that owns that law? Do you have a compliance group within your organization, a regulatory agency that you need to interface with, and so on? So going back and forth will help you have a more complete set of stakeholders, as well as make sure you haven't left out a key driver constraint. In the end, if you have a missing driver constraint, you're going to have missing needs and requirements, and you could fail system validation. We can't forget about identifying, assessing, and handling our risk. This is very important. I know in the FDA for medical devices, the FDA wants you to do very detailed risk assessment, especially from an operations standpoint between the users. They have a use failure modes effective analysis, and it's very key that you identify those and show how those are going to be mitigated. Stakeholders should be asked specifically about any issues or risks they have as part of your elicitation activities. Failing to address the risk will result in an incomplete set of needs and requirements. We're going to a whole bunch of different groups of risks, not just during operations, but what are your risks from a management standpoint? You have the resources to be successful. There's some politics issues that you have, whatever. During development, what are your risks? And one of those is going to be technology maturity and also resources from a system engineering standpoint. And then we have to forget about production risk. How is what you're doing going to affect manufacturing? Do you have the capability to manufacture this new system? Am I going to have to change my manufacturing processes, or do I need new equipment to do the manufacturing? What kind of risk might I have during system integration, system verification, system validation? How about compliance risk, meeting the standards and regulations? And then naturally you have the operational risk. So while you're using it, what are the risks? All the risks need to be assessed, how they're going to be handled, what is the severity, what is the impact of the risk, and those that you will decide you are going to mitigate. Some of those may be done by training the people, some will be done by the instructions for use, the procedures, and some you're going to mitigate through the design of your system. Either I'm going to reduce the likelihood of a bad thing happening, reduce the severity of the bad thing happening, or maybe I can just remove the risk totally. And so that's got to be reflected in my needs and requirements. And then I have to have full traceability throughout the life cycle so I can show that I have actually accomplished the mitigations I intended. And that's critical for acceptance. And then we're going to capture the preliminary integrated set of lifecycle concepts. All the preceding activities, we gained a lot of information. So now we need to define our lifecycle concepts. So whatever your lifecycle concepts are, that's what the L1, 2, 3, 4 is. And I have different stakeholders that are associated with each lifecycle. And so I have to integrate all that into one set of information for each lifecycle concept. And the ops concept document is a historic way of doing this. We have to, again, think about all the different lifecycle concepts. All of this is called preliminary because we haven't done all the proper analysis. We need to do the detailed analysis concerning feasibility, completeness, consistency before we're ready to actually define our set of needs. Exactly which lifecycle concepts you define will depend on your organization, your product line, processes, and culture. It's important in this preliminary set of information that we do get agreement from the stakeholders before proceeding. So now we've gathered all this information. So now we're going to go in through systems analysis and do our lifecycle concept analysis, maturation activities, and use of models and diagrams is really important. You don't necessarily have to have a language-based model, but it's very much advised that you do. But for simpler systems, you may be able to do stuff in just diagrams. When you talk about a fundamental system model, for any system you're doing, you're going to receive inputs, transform the inputs to outputs, and you're going to export the outputs. And so no matter what product you're developing, you're going to do that. But then I can break that down into specific functions or activities that need to be performed. The SIPOC diagram is source input. P really starts for process, but it could be a function activity, the output, and the customer or user of that information. And so when you're going through your analysis, all that data that we've collected, you're looking for what is all the functionality that needs to take place for each function. What are the inputs to that function? Where did they come from? As a result of the function, what are the outputs and where do they go? And with that, now I can connect the dots and produce a functional flow block diagram and show how this all works. And then once I have a good understanding of that, then I can start thinking about a system architecture diagram where I map key functions to architectural elements. So this is basic view of modeling at its most fundamental form. And so the manual talks about this. In the seminar, I would assume the different groups are going to use whatever modeling that they do within the organization. And if they have fidelity modeling tools, then they're going to use those as part of the exercise. Another thing on risk assessment that you can use the SIPOC diagram for is it's not enough just to say, here's the source, input, function, output, and customer, but ask yourself, what does that nominal input look like? And what does the off-nominal input look like? The same for an output. What does the nominal look like? What's the off-nominal look like? How am I going to address an off-nominal input? How am I going to prevent maybe getting an off-nominal input? How am I going to address possible off-nominal outputs? How can I prevent those? And so using this approach, Rudy's going to help you with your risk assessment, both internally and externally of your system of interest. And so iteration of the lifecycle concepts, this is the doctrine of successive refinement. It's not spiral developments. It's zeroing in on a set of feasible concepts. So we start with our preliminary concepts. We go through model development analysis and maturation, and we do trade space, define candidate physical architectures. Then we do analysis of that, technology readiness assessment, risk assessments, our trade studies. We're zeroing in on initial physical architecture corresponding set lifecycle concepts. And then we increase the resolution and repeat this in several cycles until we have uncovered a feasible set of lifecycle concepts, preliminary needs associated with those, and preliminary physical architecture. Out of that, we're going to have models, plans, budgets, schedules, because we're not just doing this for our system. We're, again, thinking about project management. We're thinking about how we're going to fund this, how much it's going to cost to do this across the life cycle. And we're developing concepts for each of the life cycle stages from both a project management standpoint as well as a system engineering standpoint. And this is all stressed in the manual. And you look at the number of artifacts that's coming out of this, it's kind of mind-blowing about all the types of data information that we need to be thinking about and collecting to be successful. And so then we define and record the integrated set of needs, and they have all these different sources. And so we're going to have traceability to those. One thing about needs is they're communicated in a higher level abstraction than requirements. I need the system to meet FDA regulation so-and-so or OSHA regulation so-and-so. That's okay for a need statement. From a requirement statement, it's too high level. I'd have to dive into specific requirements within that standard and communicate those to my set of requirements. But from a stakeholder need standpoint, that's what they need from the system to be compliant with that specific regulation. We recommend an organization like function, fit, form, quality, and compliance. Each is a different perspective of your system. A lot of modeling focus on function. The fit is how you integrate into the macro system you're part. The function is your primary functionality and performance of your system of interest. We have primary functions that we want to focus on. Then we have enabling functions. And we have to think about both of those. And the form is just the physical appearance or size or whatever. And then we have to think about all of our entities. And then we have to think about all the standards and regulations we have to show compliance with. It's a good practice to think about this kind of an organization and make sure that you address all of those. Some people that focus just on a functional model of their system, they may leave out the quality and compliance, and then they would have an incomplete set of requirements. And by doing this, if you think ahead to how you're going to organize your requirements, then whatever organization you come up with your needs, it should mirror how you're going to organize your requirements. It's going to make it a lot easier to transform between needs and requirements if you have the same outline. And using the data-centric practice of system engineering, all the needs will be traced to their sources, and they're in a form that will allow the resulting design input requirements that transform those needs to have traceability to those also. So we want to have traceability across the life cycle. The data-centric practice allows us to do this. And again, need statements don't include the word shall. Certain examples, the stakeholders need the system to do something, or the stakeholders would like the system to do something for a goal. Rather than saying the users shall be able to, say the users need to be able to. The stakeholders need the system to allow users to. Again, we're trying to communicate this in a form that it's the stakeholders looking at the system as a black box, and they're saying, what do we need from that black box without diving inside? Rather than saying the system shall meet all applicable government safety standards, which is a poorly written requirement because it's ambiguous, it's too high level, then say the stakeholders need the system to meet the applicable government safety standards and regulations. And then as part of the transformation process, you're going to identify the specific requirements that will result in those standards and regulations being met. And so these distinct formats of needs not having a shall statement really helps. Unfortunately, people say stakeholder needs and requirements, and what they fail to realize is when they say stakeholder needs and requirements, they're not one thing. They're two distinct things. They're two distinct perspectives. So really, you have stakeholder needs, and then you have stakeholder-owned system requirements. So stakeholders will define what they need from the black box, but often they'll want to go deeper and define what they think some of the technical requirements are that will result in their needs being met. So they're going to communicate both perspectives, and you need to understand the different perspectives. Unfortunately, people will treat them as one thing, and they'll assign shall statements to everything. But when you look at the level of abstraction, they're not appropriate for requirements. They are appropriate for a need statement. And so this is one of the things to think about. So once we have the needs, they're going to be transformed into the design input requirements. But before we can have those requirements, we need to have defined these needs. By following this approach, rather than just having a document with a bunch of needs in it or requirements in it, we actually have ended up with the underlying analysis. We have the models and the information from which the needs came from. And so that's really important to have that data information within our data model. One useful thing, it talks about the needs buckets. This can use to control the needs. The bucket's constrained by cost, technology, and schedule. Rather than blindly just accepting needs and requirements from people, we need to go through this filtering process. Will the needs fit in within cost, schedule, and technology? It's a good idea to include some reserves for the unexpected things that may happen. It really helps to make sure that our set is feasible, individual needs are feasible by doing this analysis. It's really helpful controlling change. So once our bucket's full and someone wants to add something in the bucket, then we have to make a decision. Can we get a bigger bucket? Will people give us more money, more time to do it? Maybe we'll remove something a lower priority, then add something a higher priority. And that's why we need to establish the priority criticality attributes of each need and requirement. And then we have to understand that there's always risk associated with what we're doing. If management wants you to add needs to the bucket and the bucket's already full, you're adding to risk. This is discussed in detail in the manual. It's important that we plan ahead for system validation. System validation showing that the system actually meets the needs. It's a good practice to define how we're going to validate that the system meets the needs when we're writing the need statements. And so we're going to ask questions for each one of those. There's what's the success criteria? What method we're going to use? What's our strategy for doing the system validation? Who's responsible? What is each organization's responsibility? If it's developed in-house, it's not as much an issue, but if there's a customer-supplier relationship, a lot of times the customer will contract out just the requirements. And so the supplier does system verification, shows they met the requirements for acceptability, but then who does the actual validation? You can meet all the requirements and fail system validation. And so is the vendor going to be part of that? They're going to do preliminary validation and the customer do final validation. A whole lot of questions to be asked on that. There's a whole section in the manual that talks about that. Planning is necessary to ensure budget, schedule, and resources are available. System verification, the system validation is going to take time and money, resources. And so we need to think about that at the beginning and include that in our budget and schedule, or we'll have an unpleasant surprise at the end. And there may be some enabling systems needed to do the system validation activities. We have to plan ahead for those and make sure they're in place. And so we define a set of attributes for all the needs. What is the system validation success criteria, strategy, and method? The responsible organization, they'll be defined and attached to each need statement. But we went through all these activities and we have a lot of outputs, not just the needs. We have a draft integrated set of needs. We have risk and a risk management plan. We have a set of feasible lifecycle concepts. We have functional architecture and analytical behavior models. We have preliminary physical architecture. We have our technology readiness assessment and technology maturation plans. We have design and system validation planning artifacts. We have our project management system engineering management plans, work breakdown structure, product breakdown structure, budget and schedules, and our other artifacts. And we have traceability established for each need. And so there's a lot of products that are going to come out of this. So it's not just the set of needs. Then the integrated set of needs are going to be verified and validated. Let's cover in the next slide. And then they're going to be baselined. And once baselined, they'll put under configuration control and managed across the lifecycle. And part of the baselining, again, is getting the stakeholders to agree on that set of needs. I was working with a client, I thought it was really interesting. They said, one of the problems we have is that our customer asked for a unicorn, but our developers provided a horse. And so you have the distinction. So if you involve the stakeholders during these gate reviews, make sure that both the developer and the customer agree that what's going to be delivered is a unicorn, then you won't have those issues. And during the requirements, architecture, and design activities, there's going to be issues that will be discovered that are going to result in a change to the lifecycle concepts and needs. So whatever you're doing here is not written in stone. You have to realize that as we get smarter, as we move through the life cycle, we may find out that we're going to have to go back and update our lifecycle concepts, change our needs. And so that's just part of system engineering. Needs verification, validation. We have an integrated set of needs. We got to validate, do the needs communicate the intent of the stakeholders? We're going to validate, do they communicate the intent of lifecycle concepts? And lifecycle concepts, we're going to validate, do they reflect the intent of the stakeholders? From a verification standpoint, needs are verified. Do they meet the organizational requirements for defining needs? This is work instructions, our design controls that we have for defining needs. And our lifecycle concepts, there's going to be organizational requirements for how we do that. Then the business submission analysis processes, stakeholder needs requirements definition processes from the INCOSE Handbook was the source of a lot of this information that we're validating against. Before baselining, we need to go through this, especially validation can't be done without the stakeholders. The stakeholder is the only one that can say you've communicated their intent properly. And so it's very important that we involve all the stakeholders, not just users and customers, but the VOX philosophy. And once verified and validated, then they're going to be baselined along with all the other project management system engineering work products and some type of a gate review, like a scope review or system mission concept review. Different organizations have different names for these gate reviews. Once everything's baseline, we have management activities to do. The manual goes into a lot of detail on needs requirements, verification, validation, management. So we've just done this on the left, the baseline set of needs. But we have all these other things, activities that are taking place. They're going to go into management process. We have to baseline things. We have to be able to communicate this properly, have to monitor and control the baselines. We have to manage unknowns. When we're developing needs, there may be TBDs, TBRs that are there. We have to manage those. Big thing is managing change, doing the change impact assessment. And that's a big advantage of our data-centric practice system engineering. If we have things linked together across the life cycle, then it makes it really a lot easier to figure out what the impact of a change is up and down the traceability chains. We have to manage control flow down allocation budgeting requirements from one level of architecture to the next. And then it goes into how to combine allocation traceability concepts to manage our requirements for completeness, correctness, consistency. It goes through managing interfaces is a key part of system engineering, then managing our system verification validation. Big costs associated with doing that. Project success depends on successful system verification, system validation. So it's something that has to be managed. All these 9 areas should be addressed in some type of a quality management system, design controls, how you're going to manage things. That's the fire hose view of high-level concept of what's section 4 of the manual. Any questions, comments?
I actually have a ton, but I bet I can only ask maybe 1 or 2. So first of all, thank you for this presentation. You presented a lot of good information there. That's hopefully a lot of us will find helpful, as I did. Let me start from your most recent slides. What caught my attention is the integrated set of needs from your area of expertise or your field of work. I'm curious how your team or the people that you've worked with, how did they go about collecting the needs? Because at my company, it's done a little bit differently, but I don't want to say yet how it's done. I'm curious to see how.
All these steps are to gain the knowledge so you can collect the needs. With all this, you look at it from that stakeholder perspective and just ask yourself in each of those 5 areas, what are the needs of the stakeholders in terms of what functionality, capabilities do they expect, what performance they expect, how they expect it to interact with other systems, what are their quality expectations. The term integrated is there because I have multiple stakeholders. And so one of the things I was doing with the lifecycle concept analysis and maturation is I was addressing all those inputs. And in some cases, I would have found that there's inconsistencies. There's maybe some feasibility issues as to what the expectations were. That's why I was doing a lot of analysis, came from that.
So in your field, the system engineer collects the needs.
The project team collects it.
Okay.
Who in the project team is involved in doing that?
Okay.
Probably should be the systems engineer. But some organizations, that might be the business analyst.
Correct.
That's what I'm different names for the people.
Yeah. In connection to that, so the product owner coming from the business department would collect all the needs from the various stakeholders. But in your presentation, I saw where you were saying that you need to get all the needs confirmed before you translate the needs to requirements. You need to get all the needs confirmed by the stakeholders. Well, if the product owner from the business collects them, so we're sort of removing the stakeholder in a way, right? So how are you suggesting that we go back to every stakeholder those needs come from and let them know?
Yes, because then if I have 10 stakeholders, they're going to express some needs that are inconsistent with each other. They're going to have some needs that are conflicting with each other. They're going to have some needs, like I said, may not even be feasible. And so that's why we do the lifecycle concept analysis and maturation to address all the inconsistencies, address completeness, address all the issues with all those inputs that we got from the stakeholders. And then through that analysis is where the set of needs come from. So now we got to feed that back to the stakeholders. In some cases, there may be one stakeholder that wanted something that we determined was not feasible. And then we're going to feed back and say, what you asked for is not feasible. This is what we decided we we're going to do. Or we say,
agreed.
So there's all of that, the analysis that allows us to come up with a feasible, complete, consistent, correct set of needs. And we're integrating all those different stakeholders. One analogy I heard is like a sausage grinder. We're throwing all that stuff into the sausage grinder and out comes the sausage, all combined into one thing. And that's what the integrated set of needs is. And it's a very important step. When we've defined validation, we've always kind of talked about that. The fact that you actually document and configuration control those needs, it may be a new concept for a lot of organizations. It's kind of been a pink elephant in the room. You can go to a lot of organizations and say, okay, what is system validation? Well, we got to meet the stakeholder needs. I say, okay, where are they documented? And I get a blank look. Part of what we're doing is we're looking to the future, addressing some of the issues with system engineering as is practiced in the past.
But this is definitely good practice. And that's what I'm mostly used to. I just wanted to get a little clarification from you. But from everything you've said, that's what I'm mostly used, which is good practice.
Okay, good. Thanks. Great question. Really good discussion.
I want to emphasize that the approach I just went through, in that not a lot of organizations practice everything I just said in the past, but when looking forward to the future of implementing MBSE, and my definition of MBSE, again, is going from a document-centric to a data-centric practice of system engineering, moving a lot of the analysis earlier with the use of models and diagrams. There's a lot of work that we can do sooner in the life cycle. In the manual in section 2, I talk about the concept of technical debt. Everything we talked about needs to be done sometime, but if you don't do it at the beginning, you're going to pay a lot more to do it later on.
Yeah.
And so it's important that we move stuff to the left. So the trend in system engineering is that why issue a contract, say, for a customer to a supplier with a set of requirements that has no underlying analysis? Feasibility has not really been established, when you could be a more informed buyer if you did a little bit more of this homework up front. If for companies that are doing new products in-house, doing this upfront work will save you tons of money later on. And then across the life cycle, there's this shift left, if you will, in doing work. So with models, we can do a lot more verification, validation activities of the design using models and simulations, so we can uncover a lot of issues that normally wouldn't have been found until you get into system verification, validation with actual hardware and software. And so this whole shift left is really key. And this shift to increased emphasis on system validation across the life cycle, not as something you just do at the right side of the V, but something you do incrementally across the life cycle. But you can't do that if you don't have something to validate against. So what happens if you're a supplier, you get a contract with a set of requirements, has no underlying analysis, the customer never communicated you really any of the needs, they just gave you this set of requirements. And so you're going through the process of developing this product, but you have nothing to validate against. You know, you may meet the contract and deliver something that met the requirements, but what good does it do if the system actually fails system validation? It doesn't do its intended use in its operational environment. Even though you could say, well, the fault is the customer's, for your reputation, you don't want your product to fail. And so we need to focus more on system validation, more on this upfront type of work. And then with the data centricity, this allows us to have that whole digital thread, allow us to manage change a lot better. The end result is to be able to develop a higher quality product, get it to market faster, and then after it's released into the market, have less problems after release, less recalls, less maintenance work, less returns. And so that's kind of the goal of this approach that we're talking about.
If I could just add one point of clarification, because a lot of people, they hear shift left, and I don't know if everybody gets the double meaning of that. Lou covered it, but it's sometimes somewhat subtle. If you think of the system engineering V, and you have all the needs and requirements and design taking place traditionally on the left side of the V, then all of the verification validation taking place on the right side of the V after physical product is manufactured. And so one aspect of the double meaning is that you're shifting a lot of the time and effort you'd normally spend in the right side of the V doing verification and validation after you have physical product. You're shifting that effort over to the left side of the V, where you're actually doing a bunch of verification and validation form of leveraging your models and doing simulation. And so the net effect of that is moving product availability to either your customer or to the market to the left. So it's kind of a double meaning there, but sometimes it's not immediately obvious. Thanks for that explanation, Lou.
And thanks for the clarification.
Okay, wonderful. Any other questions or comments for Lou?
Hey, Lou, I'm just curious. This is Susan. Do you address estimating time and effort? That's been one of the challenges I've always experienced is in, estimating the effort, estimating the time that it's going to take. I've typically worked on projects where the requirements engineering effort is constrained. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are there and if that's addressed in the manual and in the seminar.
No, the cost estimation is not directly, like I talked about the concept of technical debt, like what Bob just explained. If I wait until the right side of the V to find a problem, it costs me 10 to 100 times more if I would have discovered it on the left side of the V. The fact that we recommend that you think ahead to verification validation when you actually define the needs and define the requirements allows you to have a better grasp of what your budget and scheduling needs are. That particular part is not addressed in the manual. There's just so much that we can cover in the manual. It's already 470 pages. You could write a whole book on just estimation. But the big thing is that technical debt, if I do something now, it costs me $1. If I delay that to later, it costs me $10. So do I want to pay that extra cost, with all the interest by delaying things later in the life cycle? And there's a lot of studies to show that's true. But no, I really couldn't get to that in the manual. You can write that book.
Well, yeah, we'll see. But thanks for the insights that you've presented. Very much appreciated.
Anything else tonight?
So just a suggestion. There's so much meat and content here, and virtually none of this gets covered in university classes. I think this would be excellent to have engineers intending to go out and do product development to be exposed to this type of information, a variety of dimensions, not only theoretically, but practically with projects and maybe capstones. There's a whole world of stuff. Really, if you think about it, that would really better prepare students to go into the working world and have more value for employers to hire them if they had this kind of knowledge and experience coming out of college.
Lou touched on risk management, and he was showing the few categories where you have to do some sort of risk assessment. What I'm used to is that system engineers are mostly involved in technical risk, the product risk of it, as far as ensuring safety for the user and all that, and also compliance as well, because you have to stay compliant with standards and regulations and whatnot. But when it comes to production safety, in my department, we don't quite do anything in that regard. We do have design manufacturing, which some of the engineers do. Are you suggesting that system engineers get involved in those things as well?
One thing that goes along with systems engineering is systems thinking. And so taking that holistic view of the product across its life cycle from beginning to end, even after it's released into the marketplace, that chart I showed had post-production verification, post-production validation. It was interesting. Section 9 of the manual is called production verification. And a lot of engineers don't think about that. Production verification in a lot of organizations is a quality function where the quality people look at manufacturing and say, did we build it to spec, to design output specs? And engineers just kind of assume that takes place. This holistic view is important. And I'll give you an example. I was working with a medical device company, and they're developing an instrument. You have what they call the assay, and the assay is consisted of a biological sample and a slide or a cartridge, and then what they call reagents, different chemistries that you mix in with the biological sample in different concentrations and also at different times, depending on the high resolution images you're taking at different wavelengths. The biologists and chemists found that they could develop something that worked really good in the lab, but when they're going to make 10,000 of those and put those kits out in the marketplace, the scalability was a big issue. They could tweak around and make it work really great in the lab when they're doing one or two, but then manufacturing became a big issue, producing the test kits to give to the customers. And so they were forced by necessity to be thinking about manufacturing. But when you look at the cost of products that are being made in mass, that cost is directly proportional to how you come up with a design. If you don't have the right requirements, you could end up having to spend a lot more money to produce a unit, which reduces your profitability on a unit. And so the system engineer really has to think about that. And another place I find in system engineers is some of them say, well, I shouldn't have to worry about cost and schedule. That's the project manager's job. But that's not how we should be thinking anymore. In fact, INCOSE has a group where they've developed a project management system engineering manual where they combine the two concepts together so that the system engineers and project managers work together and not in silos. That concurrent multidiscipline team approach where we have the people involved in all life cycle stages working together, that holistic view is really needed to have successful projects. You can't just put yourself in a silo and say, what the other guys do, I'm not concerned with. It's not my responsibility.
I certainly agree with everything you just said there. I'm very familiar with the handbook. I passed the test a while back. But the challenge that I face, I'm a system engineering lead on a project. And the problem is I can only get my hands on so many things. I mean, I'm just one system engineer. And so that's why it's a challenge to cover all this ground, if you will. And I don't think the company even sees that a system engineer will need to be involved in things like manufacturing, for example. They sort of divide R&D and operation into two entities, if you will. Ops will need to worry about their stuff, and then R&D has to worry about theirs. So it would be nice to have somebody on the operations side that I work closely with. But as far as me being lead on the R&D side, it would be hard to say that I'm also covering for manufacturing. I don't know if you see what I'm presenting here, but I do agree with having this holistic thinking about building a system. Just that the reality is different.
The key thing is that manufacturing as a stakeholder, you would think they would have some requirements they would like to place on the system that would make their life easier. For instance, during manufacturing, do they have test points so that during manufacturing, you can collect certain data on parts before they're integrated into the next higher level assembly? And after they're integrated, they don't have access to that data anymore for troubleshooting. And so there's a series of requirements that you would think that they would have, they'd want to communicate and be involved into the upfront process.
They do to some extent, yes. They definitely do to some. But those, I don't see them needing some sort of high-level risk assessment, if you will. Based on the needs that have been given that are the requirements. Yeah. Maybe this subset is so small that it does not warrant a full risk assessment, if you will. But maybe a more complex system, since you're going to be dealing with so many different variables and all that, maybe that's where the risk assessment will be needed.
For more complex systems, when I talk about risk for manufacturing, are they going to have to retool? Are they going to have to take down an assembly line and retool for this new product? Or are they going to have to build a whole new assembly line to build this new product? And who's going to pay for that? And how much time is it going to take? And is it going to be ready in time? There's a whole lot of questions about the manufacturing standpoint. In fact, there's a concept, just like technology readiness levels, there's a concept called manufacturing readiness levels that need to be assessed for different projects. The lower the manufacturing readiness level, the higher the risk to the organization.
Yeah, this is a great conversation, but I know that we're coming to an end.
Yeah, great conversation, a great question, Lou. That discussion reminded me of a part of the presentation tonight where you had a decomposition of the system, L0, L1, L2, L3, and maybe this discussion about where to grab the manufacturing process requirements doesn't occur at the L0 level or the L1 level, or maybe even the L2 level. Maybe you have to go a couple levels down, and then I don't know what your thoughts might be on that, because you're making me think about it. I'm thinking about what my company's process is and the tools we use, and kind of bouncing it against Lou's presentation and just trying to just trying to synthesize it all, right? Like kind of get a lot of value out of the conversation.
That one chart I showed had the verification and validation across the life cycle.
Yeah.
On the bottom, I had those boxes I said were design controls. The design controls for the design process may contain requirements submitted by the manufacturing organization.
Right.
That's telling the design people, when you actually come up with a design to meet the design input requirements, please take manufacturing into consideration. And here's some of our requirements.
Like an example, and some of the work I've done has been fairly straightforward. I'd say that like my systems haven't been super complex, but one of the things that comes up along those lines is just manufacturing capabilities. What tolerances can you hold, so that we think about that up front? I've seen that.
Definitely.
And, that's a really simple thing. If we get, we don't do the GDP right, we design things with super tight tolerances from the manufacturing team's perspective, it may break the whole concept. We have to go back, kind of get reorganized. It can cause serious delays. Maybe that's an example of a requirement. Not really sure. Great discussion though. Great question, Randy. Yeah. On behalf of the whole chapter, Lou, thanks for taking your time to present to us. We all enjoyed the presentation and can really appreciate the thoroughness, like the completeness that's been put into that work. From my company's perspective, we had 3 people on and really appreciate it.
As always, great job, Lou.
Thank you.
Very good. And with that, we stand adjourned.